The day I turned 21 and refused to sign away my dead grandfather's land, my mother hurled a glass of red wine across my face, screaming that I was no longer her daughter. The wine hit me first as cold, then as heat. It ran down my forehead in a thin red line and soaked straight through the front of my white blouse. 60 guests stood 20 feet away under strings of cafe lights, plates of ribs balanced on their knees, laughing at something my stepbrother Chase had just said. None of them saw it happen. None of them heard the sound the glass made when it left my mother's hand, a short, wet snap, like a wrist breaking. "It's the least you can do," she said, right before she threw it. "My name is Delaney Marsh. I am the only girl in this family." And until that exact moment, on my 21st birthday, in my mother's backyard in Lake Oswego, Oregon, I still believed that meant something. 10 minutes earlier, I'd been standing by the dessert table, letting my step-aunt take a photo of me next to a sheet cake that said, "Happy 21st Delaney" in blue icing. My grandfather's watch tucked into my clutch because I hadn't wanted to risk losing the chain on the dance floor. String lights ran between two maple trees Walter had planted the year he bought the house. Somebody's toddler was chasing a beach ball across the lawn. It was, for exactly 10 more minutes, a completely ordinary party. "Sign it, Delaney." Walter's voice came from behind her, flat and reasonable, the voice he used on subcontractors he was about to shortchange. "It's just a formality. Your grandfather would have wanted the family taken care of." I looked down at the papers on the patio table. A loan collateral agreement, 42 acres of Hargrove timberland listed as security against a construction loan for Voss Builders LLC. My land, Grandpa Joe's land, held in trust for me since I was 15 years old, released to me in full that very morning when I turned 21, the ink barely dry on the trustee's transfer letter sitting in my purse. "No," I said. That was the whole sentence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My mother's face changed the way it always did right before something broke, a kind of tightening around the eyes, like she was bracing for impact she was about to cause herself. Her hand found the wine glass on the table without her even looking at it. The glass hit my cheekbone before it emptied, so there was a sting on top of the wet. Red wine ran into the corner of my mouth, tasted like tannins and copper, like I'd bitten my own lip. A woman 2 tables over gasped. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. My mother grabbed my bare arm hard enough to leave 4 white marks that would bruise purple by morning, and she pulled me across the patio, past the dessert table, past my own birthday cake with 21 unlit candles still standing in it, and out through the side gate to the front porch, in full view of the cars parked along the street. "Don't bother coming back," she said, loud enough that Mrs. Petrakis 2 houses down turned to look. "Until you learn loyalty." Loyalty. That was the word she chose. Not love, not family, loyalty. Like I was an employee who'd missed a shift. I stood on that porch in a wine-soaked blouse with my grandfather's silver pocket watch in my clutch purse, the one he'd given me at 14, with 3 words engraved on the back in tiny, careful letters. "Time will protect you." I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because people always assume the crying comes first. It didn't. What came first was a strange, clean calm, the kind you get when a decision that's been building for years finally arrives and you realize you already know what you're going to do. I got in my car and drove straight to my Aunt Carol's house in Northeast Portland, 40 minutes with the radio off, my hands steady on the wheel the entire way, wine drying stiff on my collarbone. She was the only real family I had left. My mother had cut her off almost 10 years earlier, right after marrying Walter, and I hadn't seen her more than a handful of times since, always in secret, always at a coffee shop where nobody from home would recognize either of us. Carol opened the door, took one look at my face and my ruined shirt, and didn't ask a single question before pulling me inside. I told her everything, not just the party, everything, 10 years of it. She listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when I finished, she didn't hug me. She went to a cabinet in her hallway, pulled out a thick manila folder that looked like it had been waiting there for years, and set it on her kitchen table like she was laying down a hand of cards she'd been holding since before I was born. "Walter didn't just want your land as collateral," she said quietly. "He's terrified of what happens if anyone looks at it closely." That sentence changed the rest of my life. I just didn't know it yet. I was born in Bend, Oregon, the only child of Renata Marsh and a man named Colin Marsh, who left when I was 3 and whom I have exactly one memory of: a man's hand adjusting my seatbelt in a parking lot, gone before I turned 4. My mother raised me alone for 8 years, mostly in my grandfather Joseph Hargrove's Rambler outside Estacada, 40 minutes southeast of Portland, on the edge of 42 acres of second-growth timber that ran down toward the Clackamas River. Grandpa Joe was the kind of man who fixed his own roof at 68 and grew tomatoes the size of softballs. He was the only steady thing I had. He taught me to split firewood before I was 10, taught me to read a property line off a plat map, taught me that a person's word was worth exactly as much as what they did when nobody was watching. I remember one specific afternoon, the fall I turned 9, when a logging company offered him $80,000 for clear-cut rights to the back 20 acres. I sat on the porch step and listened to him turn the man down over coffee, calm and unhurried, explaining that some things were worth more standing than cut down. And after the man left, Grandpa Joe took me by the hand and walked me the length of that property line, pointing out which trees he'd planted himself, which ones predated his own father. That land wasn't an asset to him. It was a kind of promise. And even at 9 years old, I understood I was being handed something more than dirt. My mother met Walter Voss when I was 10, married him 14 months later in a backyard ceremony I remember remember mostly for the folding chairs, and by the time I was 11, we'd moved out of Grandpa Joe's Rambler and into Walter's house in Lake Oswego, a 5-bedroom colonial with a circular driveway that Walter liked to photograph for his company's website, Voss Builders LLC, custom homes, remodels, and, eventually, though I didn't know it for years, vacation rentals. Walter came with 2 sons from a previous marriage, Tucker, 2 years older than me, and Chase, 3 years younger. From the very first week, the arithmetic of that house was obvious to anyone who cared to do it, and I did, because I was the one on the wrong side of it. When I was 13, Tucker got a used dirt bike for his birthday, and I got a coupon book my mother had printed at a copy shop, redeemable for things like 1 free chore pass and 1 movie night, your choice. When I was 15, Chase got a laptop for honor roll, and I got told that Voss family scholarships were for Voss children, and I wasn't one, not on paper, not where it counted. When I was 16, I started working weekends on Walter's flip houses, sanding trim, hauling drywall scraps, painting baseboards until my knuckles cracked, unpaid, because Walter called it learning the family business. And the family business apparently didn't extend to a paycheck for me. That same year, Tucker turned 18, and Walter bought him a used Ford F-250 worth $38,000. I painted the garage it was parked in. Carol's banishment happened almost a year before that. At a Thanksgiving dinner, I wasn't old enough to fully understand at the time. Carol had never liked Walter, not from the engagement dinner where he spent 20 minutes explaining his profit margins to a table that hadn't asked, and by the time I was 11, she'd stopped hiding it. That Thanksgiving, she pulled my mother into the kitchen and told her, loud enough that I heard most of it through the swinging door, that Walter's last company had gone under owing 3 subcontractors a combined $60,000, that she'd looked it up herself after a bad feeling wouldn't leave her alone, and that she thought my mother was marrying a man who saw people as line items. My mother told her to get out of her house and never come back, and for the most part, she meant it. I didn't understand until years later that Carol hadn't been trying to hurt my mother that night. She'd been trying to save her from something Carol could already see coming. Grandpa Joe died the November I turned 15, a stroke in his sleep, quick and by all accounts painless, though I've never fully believed there's a painless way to lose the only person who ever made you feel like you belonged somewhere. At his funeral, my mother cried in a way I hadn't seen since her own wedding to Walter, and for about 4 months after that, she was almost the mother I remembered from the Rambler. She called Carol briefly to ask her to come to the service, the one crack in the estrangement that ever opened. Carol came. Walter didn't speak to her the entire day. That crack closed again by spring, and I understood, without anyone saying it directly, that grief had made my mother soft for exactly as long as it took Walter to remind her which version of herself paid the mortgage. Grandpa Joe's will put the 42 acres into a trust in my name alone, administered by First Cascade Trust and Savings until I turned 21, with an attorney named Silas Reyes named as advisor. He also left me his silver pocket watch, the one his own father had carried, with the engraving on the back that I used to run my thumb over during the worst nights in that house. Time will protect you. I didn't fully understand what he meant by it until I was 21 years old and standing in a lawyer's office with my own forged signature staring back at me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The favoritism wasn't always dramatic. Mostly it was small, cumulative, the kind of thing that's hard to point to on any single day but impossible to deny across a decade. When I needed braces at 13, my mother told me the orthodontist quoted $4,200 and that it wasn't in the budget right now, and I wore a slight overbite through every school photo for 4 years after. That same fall, Chase got a private pitching coach at $80 an hour because Walter thought he had a shot at varsity baseball. When I missed homecoming my sophomore year because nobody offered to drive me and I didn't have my license yet, my mother said she'd just assumed I wasn't interested in that kind of thing. Tucker's homecoming that same October came with a rented Charger and a corsage Walter picked out himself. None of it, on its own, was a crime. All of it, together, was a verdict, delivered slowly enough that I spent years unable to prove it was even happening, even to myself. There was one earlier incident that I didn't understand at the time, but that I've replayed 100 times since, the way you replay a scene in a movie once you know the twist. The June I turned 18, at a small birthday dinner, Walter set a stapled packet of papers next to my plate before the cake even came out. He called it insurance paperwork, said it was routine, said something about needing my signature as a formality since the land would eventually be mine and the family carried liability insurance across all their properties. My mother nodded along like she'd heard this speech before, which I now understand she had. I almost signed it. I was 18. I wanted so badly for one dinner in that house to end without tension, and my hand was actually reaching for the pen when my phone buzzed with a text from Silas Reyes, my grandfather's old attorney, a man I'd stayed in touch with more out of loyalty to Grandpa Joe than anything else. He'd heard through Carol that there might be pressure coming. Don't sign anything involving the land until the trust vests. He'd written, not one page. Call me first. Always. I put the pen down and told Walter I wanted my own lawyer to look at it first. His jaw tightened in a way I'd learned to recognize as the split second before his mask slipped, and then it was back, smooth and reasonable. Of course, he said. Smart girl. He took the papers back. I never saw them again. 3 days later, I left for a 6-week pre-college research program at the University of Washington in Seattle. My first time away from that house for longer than a weekend. And when when I came back in August, nobody ever mentioned the paperwork again. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I wouldn't understand for 3 more years. For the 6 weeks I was gone that summer, my mother told me she'd been going through old boxes in the garage, getting sentimental, she said, missing me. She asked to borrow a small keepsake box of mine that lived on the top shelf of my closet, full of report cards and birthday cards and a program from Grandpa Joe's funeral. Said she wanted to make copies of some old photos and cards for a scrapbook she was putting together. I said sure. I didn't think about it again for 3 years. I want you to remember that detail. I promise it matters. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. By the time I turned 20, the pressure campaign around the land had become a kind of low hum underneath everything, always present, occasionally spiking into something sharper. Looking back, I can count 5 distinct moments where I thought I'd hit the ceiling of what my mother and Walter were willing to do to get that land, and every single time, they broke straight through it. The first came in the spring before my birthday, when Walter suddenly started inviting me to things. Sunday dinners I hadn't been included in for years, a company golf outing where he introduced me to 2 of his subcontractors as our future partner. He offered me a title at Voss Builders, Director of Client Relations, $45,000 a year, no real job description attached to it. I understood exactly what it was. He was trying to fold me back into the family the same way he folded a cheap countertop into a listing photo, something to make the whole package look more solid than it was. I turned the job down as gently as I could. I told him I was finishing my associate's degree and wanted to figure out my own path. He smiled and said he understood completely. He did not understand completely. Nobody who says that after being told no ever does. He tried once more at that golf outing, pulling me aside near the 9th hole while my mother laughed too loudly at something one of his partners had said. You know, he said, swirling ice in a glass of iced tea, your grandfather always said family looks out for family. I like to think that's what we've been doing here, all these years, looking out for you. I remember the specific unfairness of that sentence landing on me while I stood on a golf course wearing shoes Walter hadn't paid for, and never once thought to ask if I could afford. I appreciate that, I told him, which wasn't a lie exactly, just an incomplete sentence I let him fill in however he wanted. The second came about 2 months later, when my mother started talking about Grandpa Joe more than she had in years, always in a specific direction. He'd want the family taken care of, she'd say. He built that whole life around family, Delaney. You know that better than anyone. He'd be heartbroken to see this family struggling while that land just sits there doing nothing. This was, I'll admit, an effective tactic, because it was aimed directly at the one thing I couldn't defend myself against, my own grief. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that my mother had never once in 5 years called that land your land. It was always the family's land, or just the land, like ownership was a technicality that hadn't caught up to reality yet. That same stretch of spring, my mother started mentioning her blood pressure. Casually at first, a comment about a doctor's appointment, a new prescription on the kitchen counter, then less casually. The stress of all this is going to put me in the hospital, she told me on the phone one night, her voice thin and trembling in a way that, at the time, genuinely frightened me. You know I have a heart condition now, Delaney. Is this really what you want? Me having a heart attack over a piece of land? I spent that whole week worried sick, calling her every evening to check in, until Carol gently pointed out that this same heart condition never once stopped my mother from hosting a 60-person birthday party 3 weeks later, carrying trays of ribs across the yard herself, throwing a wine glass hard enough to leave a mark. I'm not saying she wasn't under real stress. I'm saying stress and strategy can live in the same sentence, and it took me a long time to learn how to tell them apart. The third came when Walter revealed, over a dinner he'd clearly staged for the purpose, that Voss Builders was carrying almost $900,000 in short-term debt against 2 stalled developments in Sandy and Malala, and that without new collateral, the bank was going to call the loans within 90 days. He said this while looking directly at Chase, who was 19 and about to start his sophomore year at Oregon State on a tuition plan Walter had always framed as guaranteed. I don't know how we keep Chase in school if this all falls apart, Walter said. Not to me, exactly, but very much for me. My mother's eyes went glassy on cue. This was the weaponizing the children move, and it was almost elegant in how casually cruel it was, dangling my 19-year-old stepbrother's education in front of me, like it was somehow my responsibility to fund it with land my grandfather had specifically, deliberately, left to me and me alone. I told them I was sorry Voss Builders was struggling, that I hoped they found a solution, and that the land wasn't available as part of it. I meant it kindly. It did not land kindly. Walter's jaw worked the way it did whenever a subcontractor tried to renegotiate a bid, and my mother excused herself from the table, came back 10 minutes later with her eyes red, and didn't speak again for the rest of the meal. Nobody asked what Voss Builders had done with $900,000 of debt in the first place, least of all me, though I understand now that question would have led straight to a hunting lodge with 16 beds and a $15,000 a month booking calendar. At the time, I just felt guilty for a debt that was never mine to feel guilty about, which I've come to understand was the entire point of that dinner. The fourth came 3 weeks before my birthday. At a family dinner my mother billed as low-key that turned out to include my grandmother's sister, 2 of Walter's siblings, and Tucker's fiancé, none none of whom I'd expected to see. It was, I understood almost immediately, a staged intervention, an audience assembled specifically so that my mother could perform being wronged in front of people who'd take her side by default. She cried before the appetizers were even cleared. She told the table in a trembling voice that she'd given me everything, sacrificed everything, and that I was choosing to let this family fall apart over a piece of dirt out of pure selfishness. "You have no idea what I gave up to keep this family together," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a cloth napkin someone had clearly ironed for the occasion. "And this is how you repay 15 years of it. You'd let your brothers lose everything over some trees." "They're not my brothers," I said quietly, and I watched that land across the table like a struck match. "And it's not some trees. It's the only thing Grandpa Joe left me." She said I was just like my father then, which she knew, because I'd told her once in a moment of teenage honesty was the single cruelest thing she could say to me. Walter's sister patted my mother's hand and shot me a look of open disgust, the kind reserved for people who've clearly been told the worst version of a story and never asked for a second opinion. I sat there in front of 8 people and said, as calmly as I could manage, that the land wasn't a piece of dirt. It was the only thing my grandfather had left me, and that loving my family didn't mean handing over the one inheritance that was legally, permanently mine. Nobody at that table asked why a family that supposedly loved me unconditionally needed me to prove it with a 42-acre deed. Tucker, to his credit, said nothing, but he didn't look at his father the rest of that meal, and when I got up to leave, he was the only one who walked me to my car. "I don't know what's going on with the business," he said, low enough that no one inside could hear, "but I know this isn't really about Grandpa Joe wanting anything. Be careful, Delaney." I didn't understand, at the time, how much he already suspected. The 5th ceiling break was the wine glass. You already know how that one ended. What none of them knew, standing on that porch watching me get dragged off it, was that 4 days earlier, I'd had coffee with Carol for the first time in months, and she'd told me something that made the whole shape of the last 5 years suddenly look completely different. She'd flown a drone over the Hargrove property back in the spring, just out of curiosity, just because she still loved that land the way I did and wanted to see how the timber had grown in since Grandpa Joe passed. What she found wasn't timber. It was a building, right in the center of the property, visible from above but completely hidden from the county road by a stand of Douglas fir, sat a 16-bed hunting lodge, custom timber frame construction, a wraparound cedar deck, a stone chimney rising 2 stories, a gravel access road cut in from the old logging spur that Grandpa Joe used to use for his truck. Carol pulled up the listing on her laptop right there in the coffee shop. Cascade Ridge Lodge, booked through a vacation rental platform under an LLC called Voss Mountain Rentals, $15,000 a month in peak season, and it had been running, based on the earliest reviews she could find, for just over 4 years. 4 years on land that had been in trust, in my name, this whole time. I sat there with my coffee going cold and did the math out loud without meaning to. $15,000 a month times roughly 48 months, minus the slower winter seasons. Whatever the exact number was, it was well past $500,000, generated on my grandfather's land, and I hadn't seen a dollar of it, hadn't even known the building existed. The morning after the birthday party, still in the guest room at Carol's with a bruise blooming purple on my arm, Carol introduced me to Grant Hale, a property attorney she'd worked with years earlier on a boundary dispute of her own. He met us that same afternoon, cleared his calendar the second Carol described what she'd found. He looked at the trust documents, the satellite photos, and the rental listing Carol had printed out in complete silence for almost 20 minutes, while I sat across from him trying not to fidget with my grandfather's watch. "This isn't a simple encroachment case," he finally said, setting down the last page. "If a party builds a permanent commercial structure on titled land without a lease or the owner's consent, under Oregon law, that structure becomes a fixture of the real property. It doesn't matter who paid for the lumber. It doesn't matter who swung the hammer. Once it's built on your land without your authorization, that lodge, the deck, the driveway, all of it, legally belongs to you." I remember exactly how that sentence felt landing in my chest. Not triumphant, not yet, just enormous, like a held breath I'd been carrying since I was 11 years old, finally letting go. We filed an emergency injunction that same week, quiet and fast, no warning sent to anyone, freezing any further rental bookings, transfers, or liens against the property, while ownership of the structure was formally established. Grant said the element of surprise mattered more than anything else at this stage. Once Walter's attorneys knew we were coming, he'd have time to maneuver, move money, argue possession, maybe even try to sell the lodge's furnishings and equipment before a court could freeze them. Right now, we had none of that time pressure. We used it. He filed the motion himself on a Tuesday morning, and by that afternoon, the county clerk's office had stamped it received, and for the first time since the wine glass, I felt like I was the one setting the pace instead of absorbing whatever came at me next. 2 days after we filed, before my mother's phone call, she showed up at Carol's door unannounced, still in the same silk blouse she'd worn to the party, mascara smudged like she hadn't slept. Carol wouldn't let her pass the entryway. I stood in the hallway and listened to my mother beg through the screen door, not for forgiveness exactly, but for me to come home before things got out of hand, a phrase that struck me even then as strange, since she was the one who'd hurled a wine glass at my face in front of 60 guests. Carol told her calmly that Delaney would talk to her when Delaney was ready, and not 1 minute before, and shut the door. Through the front window, I watched my mother stand on the porch for almost a full minute before she got back in her car. I didn't go go out. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other in this whole story. The version of me that could have opened that door and the version that didn't. 3 days after we filed, my phone rang at 11 at night, my mother sobbing before I even said hello. "The IRS is auditing Walter," she said, her voice cracking on every other word. "They froze one of the business accounts. We might lose the house, Delaney. Please, just come home and we'll talk. We can sell the land together, split it fairly, get through this as a family." I sat on the edge of Carol's guest bed and let the silence stretch longer than was comfortable, because for the first time in my life, I was the one who got to decide when the silence ended. "I'll take it into consideration," I said, and I hung up. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the injunction had already been filed and served that same morning. I wasn't negotiating with her anymore. I hadn't been for days. I was simply letting her talk into a phone while the paperwork that would change everything sat in a courthouse file 30 miles away. I sat in Carol's kitchen after that call, turning my grandfather's watch over and over in my palm, thinking about every frozen January morning I'd spent splitting kindling for a house that never once, not fully, called me its own. For the first time in a decade, I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't anger. It felt like the floor finally holding still under my feet. Then my phone rang again. "Grant Hale, I need you in my office. Now." No hello. Nothing casual in his voice at all. I drove into downtown Portland with my stomach in a knot so tight I had to pull over once on Highway 2I-24 just to breathe. Grant was standing at his office window when I walked in, a thick new file already open on his desk, and I could tell from the set of his shoulders that whatever was in it wasn't good. "Walter's attorney responded to the injunction," he said. "They're fighting it. Hard. Harder than I expected for a case with satellite dates this clean." "How?" I asked. "The deed's not in dispute. The trust documents are airtight. You told me yourself we had this locked down." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk without a word. It was a Clackamas County land use consent form, dated 3 years earlier, authorizing construction of a temporary recreational structure on the parcel. And at the bottom, on the line marked property owner authorization, sat a signature. My signature. I picked it up with 2 fingers like it might burn me. I stared at the loop of the D, the particular slant I've had since middle school, the small flourish under the final N that I only do sometimes when I'm not rushing. It looked exactly, precisely, like my own handwriting. I have never once in my life signed a document related to that land. I have never seen this form before in my life. "I never signed this," I said, and my voice actually shook, which surprised me because I thought I was past shaking. "I have never seen this paper." "I believe you," Grant said, his face grim in a way I hadn't seen from him yet. "But it's a very good forgery. Good enough that if a judge doesn't look closely, this changes everything." I sat there with the paper trembling slightly in my hand, and underneath the fear, something else started to surface. Cold and clear and very specific. Somebody had forged my signature on a legal document 3 years ago, right around the time I turned 18, right around the time I'd refused to sign anything at all. And staring at that impossible perfect copy of my own handwriting, I had a sick, sinking feeling that I already knew exactly whose hands had made it happen. Grant let me sit with the document for a long minute before he spoke again. "There's a notary stamp at the bottom too," he said. "Diane Kess. You know her?" I did. Diane worked the front desk at Voss Builders 3 days a week, answered phones, filed permits, kept the coffee going. I'd met her a dozen times over the years, always pleasant, always a little too eager to please Walter, the way people get when their paycheck depends on someone's mood. I hadn't thought about her in months. I hadn't thought about her as anything other than furniture in that office. "She's Walter's cousin," I said slowly, the pieces sliding into place even as I spoke them out loud. "Second cousin, I think, on his mother's side." Grant made a note. "A notary who's also a family employee, notarizing a signature that isn't real, on a form that conveniently surfaces the exact week your injunction threatens to expose an unlicensed rental operation worth $500,000. That's not bad luck, Delaney. That's a pattern." I thought about the date on the form. June 19th, 3 years ago. 5 days after my 18th birthday. 5 days after Walter had slid a stapled packet across the dinner table and I'd refused to touch it. I remembered leaving for Seattle 3 days after that dinner, a Wednesday, for the pre-college research program at UW. I remembered exactly because my mother had made a small production of packing snacks for the drive, the last real mothering gesture I could remember from that entire era. "I wasn't even in Oregon on that date," I said, sitting up straighter. "I was in Seattle. I have the program's welcome dinner on my phone. I posted a photo. There's a hotel receipt. There has to be. My mother booked the room. There's an attendance sign-in sheet from the university. I remember signing in every single morning." Grant's expression shifted, sharpened. "That's an alibi. A real one, with a paper trail, not just your word. If we can place you 200 miles away on the exact date this form was allegedly signed and notarized, that's not just reasonable doubt. That potentially proves the document is fabricated outright." He asked his paralegal to pull everything, the program's records, hotel confirmation emails, my old phone's photo metadata, and within 2 days we had a folder that put me in downtown Seattle from June 16th through July 28th of that year, with a geotagged photo from the exact evening the consent form claimed I'd been standing in a Clackamas County office signing my land away. But it was the second discovery that made my hands go cold all over again. Grant brought in a forensic document examiner, a woman named Priya Ose, who'd spent 15 years testifying falsifying and fraud cases, and she compared the signature on the consent form against 6 known samples of my real handwriting. Her report ran 4 pages, full of terms like stroke pressure and letter formation consistency, but the conclusion fit in one sentence. The signature had not been freehand forged. It had been traced, almost certainly from an existing signature, likely reproduced through a lightbox or a high-resolution scan, then transferred onto the form. I thought immediately of the keepsake box. I called Carol that night and told her, and she went very quiet on the other end of the line before she said what I already knew she was going to say. Your mother borrowed that box the summer you were 18, the summer you left for Seattle. She told you it was for a scrapbook. There was a birthday card in that box, the one Carol herself had given me for my 16th, where I'd signed the inside cover with a little joke about being old enough to drive badly. My full signature, clean, isolated, exactly the kind of clean, isolated signature you'd need if you wanted to trace one. Priya OC's report went further than I expected it to. She'd overlaid the trace signature against the signature in the birthday card at 400% magnification and found what she called hesitation marks, tiny breaks in the pen stroke where someone tracing a shape they didn't fully understand had lifted and repositioned, something a person signing their own name, even nervously, essentially never does. She also found a faint graphite ghost beneath the ink, the leftover pressure of a pencil outline drawn first and inked over second, the signature of a forgery in the most literal sense. I read that section of the report 4 times. It is a strange, specific kind of violation, seeing proof that someone spent real time, real care, tracing the exact shape of your own hand. I didn't want it to be true. I want to be honest about that, because this is the part of the story where people expect me to say, I always knew, I always suspected, but that isn't true either. Some part of me, even standing in Grant's office with a forensic report in my hand, was still hoping there'd be some other explanation, some version of events where my mother hadn't handed a stranger the private, particular shape of my own name so it could be traced onto a document that would let her husband build a rental empire on my dead grandfather's grave. Grant filed a formal fraud complaint alongside the amended injunction, and this time he made sure everyone knew it was coming. Sometimes surprise is the weapon. Sometimes, he told me, you want them to see it arrive, because watching people scramble tells you everything about who they really are. The meeting happened 6 days later, at Grant's request, on what he called neutral ground, a conference room at his own office rather than the house, with Grant present, Carol present at my request, and Walter's attorney seated across the table. My mother came, Walter came, and Tucker unexpectedly came too, sitting near the door like he wasn't sure he'd been invited on purpose or by accident. Grant laid it out plainly and without theater, because he didn't need theater. The facts did all the work. The forged consent form, the traced signature, confirmed by an independent forensic examiner, my verified location in Seattle on the date in question, backed by university records and geotagged photographs. 4 years of unauthorized commercial rental income, conservatively estimated at over $600,000, generated on land that had never, not for one day, belonged to anyone but me. Walter's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went completely still, the reasonable contractor mask he always wore just falling away, and underneath it was something closer to panic dressed up as anger. This is insane, he said, his voice climbing. We built that lodge with our own money, our own labor. That structure has nothing to do with some old trust technicality. It has everything to do with it, Grant said evenly. You built a permanent commercial structure on land you didn't own, without the owner's consent. And when the owner turned 18 and refused to give that consent, someone forged it instead. I never touched that form, Walter said, too quickly, and I watched my mother's hand tighten around her water glass. Diane notarized it, I said. It was the first thing I'd said since sitting down, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Diane works for you. Diane is your cousin. And the signature on it was traced from a birthday card that disappeared from my keepsake box for exactly 1 week. The same week my mother said she was making a scrapbook. The room went silent in a way that felt physical. My mother's face crumpled first, not into the performed grief I'd watched her deploy at a dozen dinners, but into something rawer, something that looked, for just a moment, like actual shame. I didn't know he was going to use it for that, she said, and her voice broke on the last word. I gave him the card because he asked. He said it was for insurance. I didn't ask what kind. I didn't want to know. You didn't want to know, I repeated, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. Mom, you handed a stranger my signature so it could be copied onto a document I'd already told you I wouldn't sign. You didn't have to know the details to know that was wrong. You knew. You just decided it mattered less than what Walter needed. Walter's attorney tried to redirect, started talking about good faith improvements and equitable compensation for materials, and Grant let him talk for almost a full minute before cutting in with a single sentence. Your client is welcome to file a separate claim for unjust enrichment regarding materials and labor. That claim will need to be filed from outside a jail cell, given the notary fraud exposure here, but he's welcome to file it. Tucker, who hadn't said a word the entire meeting, stood up abruptly. I watched him look at his father, really look at him, the way you look at someone when a version of them you'd built in your head just came apart in front of you. You had her keep the box for a week, he said, not to me, to Walter. I remember that summer. You told me it was for insurance paperwork on the equipment shed. He shook his head slowly. You lied to me too. Carol sat beside me through all of it, not saying a word, her hand resting flat on the table an inch from mine the entire time, close enough that I could have reached for it if I'd needed to. I didn't need to, but knowing it was there mattered more than I I expected. She'd waited almost 10 years to sit in a room like this on my side of the table, and I understood, watching her watch my mother, that this moment cost her something too. A sister she'd once loved before that sister chose a man over her own family twice. I looked at my mother across that conference table, at the woman who'd raised me alone in a Rambler outside Escalating before any of this, who used to sing off-key in the car and let me stay up late reading with a flashlight, and I felt the strange dual weight of missing her and being finished with her at the exact same moment. Walter's attorney tried once more to steer the conversation, suggesting a private settlement might still be possible, one that would keep the criminal referral from moving forward if terms could be reached quickly. Grant didn't even look up from his notes. That offer needed to come 3 months ago before we had a forensic report and a geotagged alibi, he said. It's not on the table anymore, and honestly, I'm not sure it should have been on the table to begin with. Walter's face reddened. He turned to me directly for the first time since sitting down. You have no idea what it's like to build something from nothing, he said, his voice low and hard now, all the smoothness gone out of it. I gave you a home. I gave you a family. And the second you didn't need us anymore, you came after us with lawyers. I didn't come after you, I said. You built a business on land that was never yours. And when I said no, you forged my name instead of accepting the answer. I didn't create this. I just finally had the money and the lawyer to stop pretending it wasn't happening. My voice didn't rise. I didn't want it to. I'd spent 10 years watching my mother's voice rise in that house, and I understood, sitting there, that calm was the one thing in that room I still had complete control over. I'm not doing this to punish you, I told her, and I meant it, even though I understood she'd never fully believe it. I'm doing this because it's mine. It was always mine. Grandpa Joe gave me that land because he trusted me to take care of it, and instead of protecting that trust, you helped someone forge my name to steal from me. I needed you to hear me say that clearly, one time, and now I have. I stood up before anyone else could speak, and Carol stood with me, and we left Grant to finish the legal details with people whose lawyers were about to have a very long few months. The weeks after that meeting moved faster than I could fully track. Grant amended our civil claim to include the fraud findings and filed a report with the county recorder's fraud unit, which triggered a separate criminal referral. Diane Kess lost her notary commission within 3 weeks, and when investigators started asking about other documents she'd notarized for Voss builders over the years, they found 2 more consent forms with irregularities, one involving a different parcel entirely that Walter had used as collateral for an equipment loan. Diane, facing charges of her own, cooperated fully once she understood how much exposure she had. She told investigators Walter had asked her to notarize the Hargrove form as a favor, told her it was a family matter, a formality, that I'd apparently just forgotten to come in and sign it myself. She said she believed him. Maybe she did. It didn't change what she'd done. She eventually pled guilty to a single count of notarial misconduct, paid a fine, and lost her ability to hold a notary commission in the state of Oregon for the rest of her life. I never spoke to her directly. I didn't need to. Her cooperation was, in its own way, one more piece of the wall Walter had built around himself finally falling inward. The extended family split roughly the way you'd expect once the facts came out, though not entirely. My grandmother's sister, who'd sat at that staged intervention dinner without saying a word, called Carol a week after the conference room meeting and asked, quietly, if I would be willing to speak with her. Said she'd had no idea, that she felt sick about the things she'd let herself believe without asking a single question. I met her for coffee that spring. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. It was just 2 people admitting a hard thing plainly, which, after that year, felt like more than enough. She still sends me a card every year on my birthday now, always signed, always with a short note, small proof that some threads in that family were worth keeping even after the rest frayed apart. Walter's siblings mostly went silent, the way people do when a family member becomes a liability instead of an asset. One of them, his younger sister, the one who'd shot me that look of disgust at the dinner table, sent Carol an apology months later that Carol never bothered forwarding to me. Some apologies, Carol told me, exist mostly for the person giving them. I didn't need that one. Before any of that was settled, Walter tried one more move, the kind of overreach Grant told me almost always comes right before the end. Through his attorney, he filed a countersuit claiming unjust enrichment, arguing that Cascade Ridge Lodge represented $310,000 in materials and labor that I would be wrongfully keeping if the injunction became permanent, and demanding I either pay that figure or agree to a forced sale of the property with proceeds split between us. Grant didn't even flinch when he showed me the filing. This is a man who just got caught building a fraud case with a traced signature, asking a judge to award him money for the crime scene, he said. Courts don't usually reward that. He was right. The countersuit was dismissed at the first hearing, the judge noting from the bench that a party cannot claim equitable compensation for improvements made in furtherance of a documented forgery. I sat in that courtroom in a navy blazer Carol had helped me pick out, and I watched Walter's face when the judge said the word forgery out loud, in open court, on the record, and something in me finally exhaled. Walter was charged with forgery in the second degree and criminal conspiracy, on top of the notary fraud charges tied to the equipment loan. His attorney negotiated hard, and eventually he pled to a reduced set of charges, avoiding the harshest sentencing in exchange for full financial restitution and 5 years of probation. The restitution order required him to pay me $640,000, the court's final calculation of 4 years of rental income plus interest interest, structured as monthly garnishments that Grant said, realistically, could take a decade or more to fully collect given Walter's collapsing finances. I don't think about that money the way I thought I would. Some months, a payment of $1,100 shows up in an account Grant set up to track it, and some months nothing does. And either way, it feels less like winning and more like paperwork, proof that stayed on after the feeling wore off. The IRS audit that had started as leverage against me turned out to be entirely real and entirely damning, uncovering nearly $200,000 in unreported rental income across 3 years, on top of what the county fraud referral had already surfaced. Voss Builders LLC filed for bankruptcy protection 4 months after that conference room meeting, listing debts of just over $1.1 million against assets that, once the lodge was subtracted from the equation entirely, barely covered a third of that. The house in Lake Oswego, the one with the circular driveway Walter loved to photograph for his company's website, went up for a short sale that winter and sold in November for $80,000 less than they owed on it. My mother was never criminally charged. Grant told me the prosecutor's office considered it, weighed it, and ultimately concluded that providing the signature sample, while morally indefensible, didn't clear the bar for conspiracy without proof she'd known specifically what it would be used for. I don't know if that's justice. I've stopped trying to decide. Some nights I think the law got it right. That intent is the only fair line to draw. Other nights I think the law simply doesn't have language for a mother who hands over her daughter's signature and asks no questions on purpose, because not asking is its own kind of answer. What I do know is that our family split cleanly down a line I hadn't expected. Chase, 19 and furious that his tuition fund had evaporated along with his father's business, blamed me entirely, told Carol at one point that I'd destroyed the family over a stupid piece of land, and I haven't spoken to him since. He texted me once that October, a single line that read, "Hope the money was worth it," and I stared at it for a long time before deciding not to answer. I've thought since about what I'd say if he ever texted again, something honest, something about how I understand he lost real things too, his father's business, his tuition plan, the version of his life he'd been promised. I don't think he's ready to hear that the promise was never mine to fund, maybe someday. He and my mother moved into a rental townhouse in Milwaukee that August, and my mother sent me exactly one card that Christmas, a generic one from a drugstore rack, unsigned except for her name. No note, nothing else. I still have it. I don't know why I kept it. Tucker went the other direction entirely. He'd already been quietly unhappy at Voss Builders for years, resentful of how his father ran the business. And once the whole structure of lies came apart, something in him came apart with it, but toward honesty instead of away from it. He called me himself 3 weeks after the conference room and apologized for every birthday, every ski trip, every year he'd taken his own advantages for granted without once asking why I never got the same. He also told me something I hadn't known, that he'd once asked his father directly, back when he was 20, why the lodge existed if I didn't know about it, and Walter had told him it was temporary, until Delaney was old enough to understand the arrangement. Tucker said he'd accepted that answer at the time because it was easier than not accepting it. He didn't excuse himself for that. He just said it plainly, and let me decide what to do with it. We're not close exactly, but we talk sometimes. He sent me a photo last spring of his daughter, my stepniece in whatever loose sense that word still applies, and I felt something soften in my chest I hadn't expected to feel again. An unexpected ally showed up that same month, in the form of a letter from Silas Reyes, Grandpa Joe's old attorney, the same man whose single text 3 years earlier had stopped me from signing away everything at 18. He'd heard about the case through Carol, and wrote to tell me he'd kept his own file on the original trust all these years, including a handwritten note Grandpa Joe had left with him, unsent, apparently meant for me if things with the family ever went sideways over the land. Grant used pieces of that file to strengthen our chain of title argument. I used the note for something else entirely. It said, in my grandfather's blunt handwriting, that he'd started to worry about Walter years before he died, and that he'd built the trust specifically to survive pressure he suspected might come. He'd seen it coming before any of us. I keep that note folded in the same drawer as the watch. There was a night, about 2 months after everything, when the legal texture of it all, the depositions, the property valuations, the accountant Grant hired to trace the rental income back to a specific dollar figure, finally quieted down enough for the grief to catch up with me. I drove out to Estacada alone, parked at the county road, and walked the old logging spur up toward the ridge where Grandpa Joe used to take me to check on the timber. The lodge sat there, empty for the first time in 4 years, silent except for wind moving through the cedar shakes on the roof. I sat on the front steps of a building I now legally owned and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of it. Not for the money, not for the theft, but for the version of my family that never got the chance to exist. The mother who might have protected me instead of a marriage. The stepbrothers who might have grown up seeing me as a sister instead of an obstacle. I grieved that family the way you grieve someone who died, because in every way that mattered, it had. I let myself remember the good years too, sitting there, because grief isn't honest if it only remembers the ending. My mother teaching me to parallel park in an empty church lot when I was 15, laughing every time I clipped the curb. The two of us splitting a milkshake at a diner outside Estacada after Grandpa Joe's memorial, not talking, just being quiet together in a booth, which was its own kind of comfort. I don't think she set out at 29, widowed young by divorce and scared of raising a kid alone, to become someone who'd hand a man her daughter's signature signature to trace. I think fear did that to her, slowly, one compromise at a time, the way water eventually cuts a canyon. Understanding how it happened doesn't undo what it cost me, but it let me put the grief down instead of carrying it as rage, and that distinction, that night on the steps, felt like its own kind of inheritance. Getting there took most of a year, longer than any of us expected. The county required a full re-permitting of the lodge as a legal short-term rental, since it had operated for 4 years without proper licensing, and Grant spent 3 months negotiating with the planning department to avoid the structure being classified as non-compliant and subject to removal. There was a real week in early spring where it looked like the whole building might have to come down regardless of who owned the land beneath it, a code technicality nobody had considered in the excitement of winning the ownership fight. Grant found a variance that saved it, citing the structure's existing utility hookups and septic capacity as grandfathered infrastructure, and I remember calling Carol from the parking lot outside the county building, laughing and crying at the same time, the first time those two things had happened together instead of the other. Grant helped me set up a management company for Cascade Ridge Lodge with Carol as co-signer, and we relisted it under my own name that spring, Hargrove Ridge Retreat, honoring the only name that had ever actually earned the right to be attached to that land. I hired a local property manager, a woman named Bethany who'd run vacation rentals along the Clackamas for a decade, and we spent a weekend together repainting the guest room doors, replacing a set of antler light fixtures Walter had installed that never once felt like they belonged to Grandpa Joe's forest. The rental income, all of it now, funds a small scholarship in Grandpa Joe's name at the community college near Estacada for students studying forestry and land management, the kind of thing I think he'd have actually wanted his money spent on. I'm 22 now, a year out from that porch, that wine, that word my mother chose over daughter. I live in a small rental in Milwaukee, not far, oddly, from the townhouse where she lives with Chase, though we've never once run into each other, and I've stopped wondering whether that's coincidence or something quieter, both of us keeping careful distance without ever discussing it. I finished my associate's degree that spring after all, the one I'd told Walter I wanted to focus on, and I'm 2 semesters into a bachelor's in natural resource management at Oregon State, mostly online, with a trip out to Estacada every other weekend to check on the property the way Grandpa Joe used to check on his timber. I keep his old habits without really meaning to, the small, unremarkable rituals of caretaking that somehow ended up mattering more than any legal document ever did. I still walk the property line every season and note where the fir needs thinning. I still stack firewood a certain way he taught me, bark down, so the rain runs off instead of soaking in. Carol comes with me sometimes, and we sit on the same porch steps where I once cried alone, drinking coffee out of a thermos, not saying much, which after everything is its own kind of peace. There's a version of this story where I tell you I feel triumphant, and some days, driving up that gravel road with the lodge finally lit up honestly, guests' cars parked out front, I do feel something close to that. But most days it's quieter than triumph. It's closer to relief, the specific, unglamorous relief of a fight finally being over, mixed with a loss that never fully stopped aching underneath it. I don't think those two feelings cancel each other out. I've stopped expecting them to. I still carry my grandfather's watch. I wound it this morning out of habit, the way I do most mornings, and read the engraving again, even though I have it memorized. Time will protect you. I understand it differently now than I did at 14. I used to think it meant time would simply pass, and things would eventually be fine. Now I think he meant something closer to patience as a weapon. The specific, quiet power of refusing to sign what isn't yours, of waiting for the paperwork, the proof, the truth to finally catch up with the lie. I think about how close it came to not working. If Carol hadn't flown that drone over the ridge out of nothing more than sentiment, if Silas Reyes hadn't texted me 3 years earlier over a gut feeling he couldn't fully explain, if I'd been anywhere else that June instead of 200 miles north in a dorm room in Seattle, unknowingly building the exact alibi that would eventually save everything my grandfather left me, none of it felt like strategy while it was happening. It felt like small, ordinary decisions, made by people who loved me enough to trust their own instincts. I've come to think that's most of what protection actually looks like. Not one dramatic rescue, but a series of quiet, unglamorous choices made by people willing to keep showing up long before they know whether it will matter. I turned 21 and refused to sign away my grandfather's land, and my mother threw a glass of wine in my face and told me I was no longer her daughter. I've thought about that sentence 100 times since, and here's what I've settled on. She was wrong about almost everything that year, but she was right about one thing, whether she meant it the way I've come to understand it or not. That day, on that porch, something between us really did end. I don't call what's left a mother anymore. I call it a woman I used to belong to, before I learned that belonging isn't something you're owed, it's something you protect, carefully, patiently, the way you'd protect the only piece of solid ground your grandfather ever left you standing on. I still miss her. I want to be honest about that too, because the story doesn't feel true without it. Some nights I miss the mother from the Rambler more than I'm angry at the mother from the porch, and I don't think that ache is ever fully going to close. But I have the land. I have the lodge, run honestly now, in daylight, under my own name. I have Carol, who never once asked me to prove I deserved her loyalty before she gave it. And I have a silver watch that's kept better time than anyone else in that family ever did.